more money for Afghanistan. A donors' conference in Tokyo pledges $16 billion over 4 years. Is this the solution to Afghanistan's problems, or is it another dose of painkiller? And are there enough safeguards to make sure the money goes where it's supposed to? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to Inside Story. I'm Sahil Rahman. Donors at a conference on Afghanistan have pledged to give it $16 billion in civilian aid over 4 years in an attempt to safeguard its future after foreign forces leave in 2014. The pledge came as Afghanistan agreed to new conditions to deal with endemic corruption. The Afghan economy relies heavily on international development and military assistance. Bernard Smith is in Kabul and has this report.
Please don't forget us. That was the message the Afghan president brought to Tokyo. Hamid Karzai was asking for around $4 billion a year in foreign aid to keep his government functioning.
Today, I request Afghanistan's friends and partners to reassure the Afghan people that you will be with us as we seek to strengthen Afghanistan as a peaceful, democratic and self-reliant country.
The Afghan government got what it wanted. In return, it's agreed to mechanisms that will monitor progress on tackling corruption.
To ensure more efficient and effective use of the international community's assistance to Afghanistan, we also agreed to establish a clear, well-defined mechanism for mutual accountability. This mechanism, which we have agreed to call the Tokyo Mutual Accountability Framework, will be a clear guide for all of us to measure our progress in reaching the goals we have defined at today's conference, based on the specific indicators.
The donors in Tokyo say aid has made a difference. 8 million girls and boys now go to school, compared with 1 million boys 10 years ago, for example. Child mortality has been halved, the sort of advances that risk being reversed if the aid dries up. The $4 billion a year in foreign aid pledged at the Tokyo conference will go a long way to calming nerves here. There had been fears in Afghanistan that the country risked being forgotten as foreign combat troops worked to complete their withdrawal from the country by the end of 2014. And as if we needed a reminder of the precarious security situation here, a series of roadside bombs on Sunday in Kandahar have left a large number of people dead and wounded. Bernard Smith, Inside Story, Kabul.
Afghanistan has received nearly $60 billion in civilian aid since 2002, according to the World Bank and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The US is by far the largest donor, with official development assistance reaching nearly $3 billion in 2009 to 2010. Japan, the second largest donor, gave over $500 million to Afghanistan during the same period and is expected to provide up to $3 billion by 2016. Germany and Britain come next as major donors. They said they will maintain aid funding levels to Afghanistan. Its neighbouring countries are also among 70 countries and organisations that attended the donors' conference. Figures are hard to verify, but Iran said that in 2010 it provided $500 million for reconstruction projects such as religious schools. Pakistan announced in May this year $20 million to help the country, quote, build itself and fight against the militants. This money has been used to support the Afghan security forces. As for India, it recently pledged $500 million in aid, a move likely to raise Pakistani fears about Indian influence in Afghanistan. So, why does the world continue to be so generous with Afghanistan despite past blunders? Well, to answer this question, we're joined by our guests. In Kabul, we have Janan Mosazai. He's the spokesman for the Afghan Foreign Ministry. Also in Kabul, Wahid Omar, political commentator and former spokesman for the Afghan President Hamid Karzai. And in Washington, D.C., Omar Samad, he's a former spokesman for the Afghan Foreign Ministry and a former ambassador to Canada and France. He's currently with the think tank US Institute of Peace. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Mr. Janan Mosazai, can I start with you first, sir, in Kabul? $16 billion pledged to the government of Afghanistan, much more than was expected. How surprised are you at the international generosity afforded to you over the last 24 hours?
We feel very positive and very gratified and grateful about the pledges coming out of the Tokyo conference. We see this as a statement of broad and firm international support for long-term peace, stability and security, but also economic development and progress in Afghanistan, which was the main topic of the Tokyo conference. This, we believe, is the beginning of a renewed partnership between Afghanistan and the international community. We would like to see a shift in the relationship between Afghanistan and the international community from one where Afghanistan is a poor receiving country, receiving charity and international assistance from its partners in the region and beyond, to a relationship where Afghanistan is a partner to the international community in all the efforts that we have been together in over the past decade, whether it's the fight against international terrorism or whether it's increased stability, peace and prosperity in this critical region. We had reached an agreement with the international community late last year at the Bonn conference in Germany that for Afghanistan to reach a stage where it's a self-reliant, more developing country, it requires at least another decade of significant, special and continuing assistance from the international community, and we are very pleased to see the realization of that broad political commitment in Bonn, in Tokyo, where we have seen a very firm commitment of financial assistance with Afghanistan so that we can fill the budget deficit that we will be facing, the fiscal gap that we will be facing after the withdrawal of international forces from Afghanistan.
Okay, let me bring in. Yeah. So let me bring in Wahid Omar. Okay, I think you've set your stall out there, sir, as a government spokesman. I want to bring Wahid Omar in here. You were former spokesman for the president. I've heard all of this sort of statement before from various spokespeople, whether it's foreign ministry or the president's spokesman, and yourself. I mean, what's your reaction to the way this money has come in, and do you agree with Mr. Mosazai that this money is going to be accountable, everything's going to be transparent and clear, and Afghanistan's going to live happily ever after?
Well, number one, this is very good news. Of course, a pledge of 16 billion for the next 5 years. It's on the development. It's important for Afghanistan. I think it's going to be the last major conference, economic conference on Afghanistan before the elections 2014. And the fact that despite all the difficulties around the world, economic difficulties, that donors still come forward and pledge to Afghanistan, it shows that Afghanistan is still important, and that is a welcome news. But I think pledges of money have never been a problem in the past in Afghanistan. Everything starts after the pledge. There are quite a few things that we need to consider. Now that $16 billion has been pledged to Afghanistan, number one, are the donors going to be are they going to materialize this money into actual financial assistance for the Afghan government? That's number one. Number two, do we have the capacity to absorb this money? Have we prioritized programs where this money is going to go to? Because our problem, remember Kabul Conference 2010, money was pledged, but the problem started when donors came to the president asking for major programs where this money could go to. And I think we had been a bit lazy in developing those programs. Remember Tokyo 1, money was pledged, and we had NSP and other major programs, road programs and others where the money went to. This time around, I haven't seen, probably it's a problem of communications, but we haven't seen clear programs, economic programs where this money is going to go to. And question number two is the question of transparency, both on the part of donors and on the part of our government. Is this money going to be transparently spent on the part of donors and on the part of the Afghan government?
And I will come to that. I will come to transparency. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I will come into that. And there are those very fine, delicate issues that we will hopefully gradually discuss through the next half hour. I want to bring in Omar Samad here. Sir, as a member of the Foreign Ministry, and now you're part of a think tank in the past, you can perhaps take a step back and look at what's going on in Afghanistan from a US prism, perhaps, and how much of this aid really is or should be going to the right areas, and in fact where it needs to go if the issues of transparency and corruption can be solved.
Yes, so I also agree that this is good news for Afghanistan, but let's not forget we have the last 10 years as an example, 11 years actually, since Tokyo won in 2002 all the way to the present time. There has been progress on one hand, and we can give statistics about it, but there's also uncertainty about the future. There is a sense of worry on the part of the Afghan people. There is still an insurgency, however you want to term it, that is nagging and that is taking space that would otherwise be used, that should be used for development and growth in Afghanistan. We need to take care of that. I think that we can pledge as much as we want to, but as long as the security situation in Afghanistan is not taken care of, and as long as there is no reconciliation that would be just and fair and acceptable to the Afghan people eventually, then all of these attempts will have minimal impact. So we need to prioritize correctly in terms of where, what kind of money, how to focus the money, how to prioritize, how to be accountable, how to make it sustainable, and to make sure that at the end of the day we send the right messages both to the Afghan people in terms of delivery and to the international community, above all to the region where some of our problems lie. So I think that Afghanistan is not just about its economy, it's not just about its social problems or geopolitical problems. It's a collection of issues that have to be dealt with, and I think the international community is attempting to do so, as we saw with Chicago, taking a shot at trying to resolve the security issues of Afghanistan beyond 2014, and now Tokyo with the development and economic issues. So it has to be comprehensive in an integrated manner.
Okay, well, let's take one of those issues that all of you have touched upon, and it is about accountability. Corruption is the big word that often is associated with large amounts of money going into Afghanistan, and we continually hear that various politicians are or are not corrupt. Let me come back to Janan Mozazai. I mean, whether it's a senior politician, we've often heard the president and some of his aides are or are not. How are you going to reassure the international community? Let's just talk about corruption as an issue, one issue, that corruption can be dealt with, and you have those mechanisms in place that the international community want in place before some of the $16 billion arrives in Kabul.
Well, there are a couple of important issues here. First of all, corruption is a real problem. It is something that has been a major obstacle and a major impediment on our way to sustainable development, not only economic development, but also the improvement of the security situation and also governance in Afghanistan. It is something that we acknowledge, and it's something that we are trying to tackle. But we also have to remember that corruption is not only an issue that plagues the Afghan government. Unfortunately, it has been an issue that has been very closely associated with the expenditure of money in Afghanistan, of international donor money spent by our international partners and by international organizations outside the Afghan state structure. This is something that that is also a major issue, and it is something that we have repeatedly referenced.
How do you think you're going to change that, though? How do you think you're going to change that? How do you think you're going to change that?
That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point I was getting to. We're very pleased that the Afghan government and the international community were able to come together and create a new mutual accountability mechanism called the Tokyo Mutual Accountability Framework at the Tokyo conference, which will basically ensure that the money, the over $16 billion pledged in Tokyo, will be spent transparently, that it will be spent effectively, and that there will be the least amount of corruption, if any, in the expenditure of all this money on the part of the Afghan government, but also on the part of the international community, because 80% of the international assistance money in Afghanistan still continues to be used outside the Afghan government channel. This framework will work at multiple levels. Number one, it will work at the inside Afghanistan at the level of the so-called Joint Coordination and Management Board, which is basically a committee of the international community of donor countries, the United Nations and the Afghan government, that decides decides and approves major development projects. This is where the Afghan government and the international community will basically enhance oversight,
well, let me bring in then
monitoring and review mechanisms. And secondly, there will be senior official levels and foreign minister level meetings within the context of the Tokyo Mutual Accountability Framework every 2 years to review the performance of the Afghan government and also the international community, and to bring about course corrections and reforms where necessary.
Well, let me bring in Wahid Omar. Weren't these sort of mechanisms put in place when there were previous donor conferences, when billions of dollars arrived over the last decade? You fielded questions in many a press conference from international journalists that often accused either the president or his close associates of corruption. So tell me, has anything really changed? I mean, you're not in government anymore.
I think I'll start from where Janan finished. Yes, the problem is twofold, that's for sure. Lessons learned from the past. Number one, on the part of international community, they have to ensure that this money doesn't go to international contractors who spend all the money on their own security and other unnecessary costs. So a $400 million project doesn't end up into, say, $40 million project because because the rest of the money goes to the administration and security costs and everything else. That this money does not go to the contractors who have a bad record in the past. Remember Kabul Conference 2010. The decision was that 50% of this money will be channeled to the Afghan government. It didn't happen. There is a problem on the part of our government as well. So on the part of our government, we need to ensure that we have enough planning. We don't have an economic planning commission. There is little coordination between our economic actors within the government. So we don't have priority programs where they go to the donors and say, this is my program and I need this much money for it. Because the problem is also on our part is corruption and lack of capacity. But I think lack of capacity on the part of our government is problem number one. In the past, we have not been able to materialize some of the pledges because we have not been able to bring on the table proper proposals. That's why USAID and many other international development organizations and contractors have stolen that money into their project because we have not been able to bring in. And the second thing is, of course, corruption. Corruption, I think anybody in the government and outside the government in Afghanistan will agree that corruption is a major problem, that some of this money goes to people who actually have become millionaires and billionaires in the past. It does not go to the Afghan people. I don't know how in the last 1 year that's remaining of the current government of Afghanistan, how they are going to address that issue. I don't think it's going to be easy for the Afghan government to show any tangible progress in terms of fighting corruption, because next year is going to be election year, and the worst year for fighting corruption for any government would be the election year. So on the part of Afghan government, I think they will have one priority, and that's going to be to do a proper transition of the political power to a new government which has the credentials and the qualification to fight corruption and to assure the Afghan people that the money that is pledged for the next 5 years is going to be spent accountably and transparently. I don't see much of a room for the current government to be able to show tangible results, but any effort by the current government, of course, will be welcome.
Okay, well, Omar Samad, you heard what was said there. I mean, would you agree in that also that what Wahid was saying was that the government doesn't have the capacity, i.e. be that the manpower or the experience to actually offer the international community, these are the type of projects we want to do, this is where we want to spend the money, and then execute it accordingly?
Well, obviously, capacity and weak institutions and weak capacities have been a problem plaguing Afghanistan for the past 11 years or so. There has been improvement in some areas, but not enough. And much more needs to be done. And I hope that some of the pledges made at Tokyo will be focused on trying to build responsive and responsible and accountable institutions as well as capacities that are needed to run them. But on the question of corruption, you have different types of corruption in Afghanistan, from graft to fraud to nepotism to even what Mr. Wade Omar was referring to in some ways is political corruption, which with elections coming up within the next 2 years is going to be something to watch for and to try to avoid at all costs, because we do not want a repeat of elections in 2009 and 2010. The Afghan people, the international community, I think, has made it clear that they want to see a political transition that is as just, fair, free, and transparent as possible, so that there is a legitimate transfer of power and a peaceful one at that. But let me also say that if you look at the Tokyo timeline, what was just agreed to today in Tokyo, you see that the pledges are made for the next 4 years, up to 2015. It's not pledges made beyond that at this point. And I think there's a reason for that. The reason is, on one hand, the international community would like to see the Afghans deliver on some of these promises made and on what the framework calls for in terms of mutual accountability. And I think they also want to see a legitimate transfer of power by 2014. And also they want to see how we are going to collectively handle the issue of corruption between now and 2015. So it's sort of a test time for Afghanistan and for the international community, because I do also agree that the corruption, as in a general sense, the corruption problem is not just an Afghan problem. It also obviously has an international component that needs to be addressed, and the Afghans, of course, have the larger share of the responsibility.
Well, I think we've talked about accountability and transparency, and let's move on now in a moment to security, but let's just bring our viewers up to speed with a little bit more information, because Afghanistan has become particularly dependent on foreign donations since the US invasion in 2001. It's one of the world's 10 poorest countries and has received nearly $60 billion in civilian aid since 2002. Now, according to the World Bank, foreign aid makes up 97% of its gross domestic product, and 90% of the Afghan government's funding comes from foreign sources, which, as the World Bank has warned, makes it particularly vulnerable to economic collapse if international donors pull funding out too fast. And in terms of pulling out, the security issue is also a very big one. 2014, a complete withdrawal of American and NATO troops. And so one has to say that development can only happen, Mr. Mozazai, successfully over the next few years, up to 2014 and beyond, if the security situation across the country can be certainly controlled.
Well, as you're well aware, the transition process in Afghanistan, transition responsibility for security from international forces to Afghan forces is in full swing. It's in its third phase, and by the completion of this phase, 75% of the Afghan population will be under the control of the Afghan National Security Forces. And we have the confidence, given the investments that have gone into the training, equipping, and fielding of Afghan National Security Forces, both the Army and the police, over the past couple of years, that they will be able, by the end of 2014, by the time all international forces withdraw from Afghanistan, to provide for the defense and security of the Afghan people. And we are also confident in terms of the long-term funding of the Afghan National Security Forces because of the NATO summit in Chicago, the pledge of $4.1 billion of annual
it's all statistics and I'm sorry, sir, it's all statistics and fine words, though, isn't it? At the end of the day, there are many millions of Afghan people who do feel scared when the sun goes down at night that they don't have proper security. And to actually say that many, by the end of 2014, will, the withdrawal of the Americans will feel safe is perhaps a little bit ludicrous when in the last 24 hours we've seen video footage of a woman apparently being shot by a Taliban member just an hour out of Kabul. That isn't security, is it, for the masses?
Well, look, I think we will continue to have security challenges, and there are multiple avenues through which we're trying to address the security situation. It's not only the security problem in Afghanistan is not going to be solved through military means alone, and that's the second point I was trying to make. There's a political process going on to make sure that we have a peace process in Afghanistan that's inclusive, that basically opens the way for the Taliban and other armed opposition groups that have sanctuaries, support bases, and training camps outside Afghanistan to come into Afghanistan to join the political process, so that together, both on the military front and also on the political front, we can create the environment not only for peace and stability in Afghanistan, but also for long-term economic development and the strengthening of Afghanistan's young democracy. Now remember, Afghanistan is a poor country, but it's also a potentially extremely rich country. Afghanistan has a minimal of $3 trillion of mineral resources. Afghanistan is also an extremely fertile country when it comes to the agricultural sector in Afghanistan. We also sit in an extremely important geopolitical region. So
I'm sure
developing Afghanistan's
I'm afraid I have to interrupt you. I'm afraid, Mr. Moses, I have to cut you off there. We've run out of time on this debate, but I'm sure we will be talking about the security of Afghanistan in many other future Inside Stories. To all of my guests, Jahan Mosazai in Kabul, along with Wahid Omar, thank you. And in Washington, Omar Samad. Thanks, gentlemen, for joining us on this edition of the programme. We do appreciate your opinions on Inside Story. Do email us if you want to speak to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Sahil Rahman. Thanks very much for your time and company.